Hi, my name is Matthew Jiwa, and this is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2022 meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology titled Hedonism in Information Search, Biased Information Seeking Leads to Biased Beliefs. And it's beliefs I want to start off by talking about, specifically polarized beliefs. And to illustrate this, we'll be looking at beliefs about the likely outcome of the 2020 US presidential election about 2 weeks prior to its occurrence, first amongst Democratic supporters, whose general consensus seemed to indicate that Joe Biden was the likely winner, although there were varying degrees of confidence. However, when we look at the Republican supporters, we see that the consensus there is that Donald Trump is the likely winner, again with varying degrees of confidence, but with as many as 23% believing that the outcome is all but assured. Now, these two distributions of beliefs couldn't really look more different. They're effectively two different groups living in separate realities. And these polarized beliefs are far from harmless. They can lead to distrust in the democratic process, as exemplified by the storming of the Capitol building, and to lack of consensus on how to tackle existential issues like climate change. So it's important that we understand how these structures arise, what differences between these groups exist that lead them to form such polarized beliefs. And one key determinant is, of course, media consumption. So in the US, those who are left-leaning or moderate will likely rely on news sources like these, which report broadly positively on Democratic candidates like Joe Biden, whereas those on the right will tend to rely on sources like these, which report more positively on Republican candidates like Donald Trump. And when we look at these example articles, it becomes clear how these separate media diets would lead to the formation of polarized beliefs. This isn't something we can just dismiss as a partisan issue either. It only takes a step back of 4 years to see a similar pattern, but with a different eventual outcome. So if this bias towards congenial news sources leads us so readily astray, then why do we engage in it? There are a couple of key candidate explanations I want to outline. Firstly, that this is entirely rational Bayesian behavior. For example, those supporting Hillary Clinton might have prior beliefs that frame her as more competent or more likable and therefore more likely to succeed. And as a consequence, they might see news about her successes as more believable, leading them to place more trust in sources that report on her from a positive angle. Alternatively, we could argue that if you want Clinton to win, then news about her successes might evoke positive affective states, which would also lead you to favor sources that report on her from a positive angle in order to achieve those positive affective states. Now, these explanations aren't mutually exclusive by any means, but the individual contributions of each to behavior can be hard to examine because they effectively predict the same patterns of behavior. So within this study, we wanted to focus on this idea of informational hedonism and ask, to what extent does this influence information selection? What mechanisms underlie this? And what are the consequences of engaging in this behavior? So in study one, subjects participated in a series of lotteries in which they could either win, in which case they won 20 cents, or they could lose, in which they won nothing. They weren't shown the outcomes of these lotteries, however. What they were shown instead was a prediction of the outcome of the lottery made by one of two available psychics. For each of their lotteries, they could choose which of the two psychics' predictions they'd like to see. And to help them choose, they were first shown a series of example predictions made by both of the psychics. So in the example predictions, the psychics would predict the outcome of some irrelevant lottery, and then the true outcome of that lottery would be revealed. And this was repeated 5 times. During these example predictions, psychics could vary on 2 key factors. Firstly, how accurate their predictions were, so how often they correctly predicted the true outcome. And secondly, how positive their predictions were, so how often they predicted wins relative to losses. After being shown the 5 examples, participants were allowed to choose whose prediction they would like to see for their own lottery, and their chosen psychic would then predict the outcome of their lottery, and the true outcome was not shown. Now, importantly, psychics that made more positive example predictions were also more likely to make positive predictions for the participant's own lottery. So if during the example predictions, a psychic predicted wins over and over again, then they would likely predict a win for the participant's lottery if they were selected. Now, all of this on screen constitutes a single trial. We had 16 trials in a block, and after a block of 16 trials, participants were asked to estimate the number of wins they thought they had achieved in that block and provide a confidence rating associated with that estimate. We had an original sample size of 225, and after exclusions for failing to understand the instructions and for self-reporting random choice behavior, we had a final sample of 158. Getting into the results, the first thing we wanted to check was, okay, if the two psychics were equally accurate during their example predictions, but one of the psychics predicts wins with a higher frequency than the other, which of the two psychics do participants tend to prefer? And what we found is that on average, participants tended to prefer the psychic who predicted wins with a higher frequency. We see something similar when we look at trials in which the two psychics were not equally accurate. So in this plot here, we have on the y-axis the probability of choosing the more accurate psychic. And we've divided this up by trials in which on the left, the more accurate psychic predicted fewer winning outcomes than the less accurate psychic during their example predictions. And on the right, trials in which the more accurate psychic also predicted more win outcomes than the less accurate psychic. So what we can see is that while accuracy is important across the board, when the more accurate psychic is also predicting more wins, we're more likely to view their prediction. In order to better understand this behavior, we constructed a series of computational models. So firstly, the accuracy and positivity model. Within this model, participants consider both the accuracy and the positivity of psychics' example predictions when choosing whose prediction to view. We also had an accuracy only and positivity only model, fairly self-explanatory. Participants only considered the accuracy or only considered the positivity of the psychic's example predictions when choosing whose prediction to view. Finally, we had the accuracy and positivity tiebreak model. Within this model, only accuracy was considered when choosing between the two psychics, but if the two psychics were equally accurate during their example predictions, then positivity was added into the model as a sort of tiebreak criterion. So we fit all four of these models using a hierarchical Bayesian modeling procedure, and then compared them using approximated k-fold leave one out cross-validation, where each fold was a single participant's data. Looking at the model fit statistics, it's the accuracy and positivity model that seems to provide the best fit to the data. However, when we look at this at a subject-specific level, we find that this is actually driven by a subset of participants. Around 30% of participants were best fit by the accuracy and positivity model, whereas about 45% were best fit by the accuracy-only model. We can see how these different sort of groups of participants cluster together. So on the y-axis here, we have the accuracy parameter. How much did participants care about how accurate the psychic's example predictions were? And on the y-axis, the positivity parameter. So how much did they care about how positive the psychic's predictions were? And what we can see is that, for example, participants whose data was best predicted by the accuracy-only model, those are the blue dots, tended to have a high accuracy parameter and a low positivity parameter, and so on for the other groups. So that's everything for the choice behavior. The next thing we wanted to address is, okay, how do these different information-seeking behaviors affect the beliefs that we form about the world state? And just to explain what we mean about the beliefs about the world state, just to remind you, we had participants estimate the number of wins they had achieved during a block at the end of that block, and also provide a confidence rating for that estimate. So that gives us a proxy for beliefs that the participants formed about the world state. The first thing we need to consider, though, are the effects of biased information seeking on the information that we view. So within this experimental design, those who preferred psychics who were biased towards a positive response were shown more positive predictions by those psychics for their own lottery. This was an inherent part of the design designed to mimic real world situations. What's more interesting, though, is that participants then used that information in order to inform their beliefs about the world, such that those exposed to positively biased information tended to form positively biased beliefs. So what we have here is the mediated effect of biased information seeking on biased beliefs. And when we look at the posterior distribution of the indirect effect, it shows a clear positive effect. But one question that remains is, do those participants who seek biased information show some kind of meta-awareness of the bias in the information they're consuming? So are they aware that they're consuming biased information that might not be that accurate and therefore have lower confidence in the beliefs that they form? And what we find is that this is not the case. If anything, those who seek biased information tend to have higher confidence in their beliefs than those who don't seek biased information. All right, so just to summarize the findings of study one, we observed biased information seeking in about 55% of participants. Those who sought biased information tended to form a biased view of the world, and those views were not tempered by a decrease in confidence. But this does leave us with an open question, and that is, are participants choosing to view predictions from positively biased psychics because they trust those psychics' predictions more? or because they want to be shown positive predictions about the outcomes of their own lotteries. So in order to differentiate between these two explanations, we conducted a follow-up study in which we asked, do participants see positively biased predictors as more credible? Within the paradigm for this study, we only showed one psychic at a time, again with 5 example predictions with the true outcomes also shown. Again, psychics would vary in how accurate and how positive those predictions were. However, this time there was no choice phase. After the example predictions were shown, that same psychic would immediately go on to predict the outcome of the participant's own lottery, and the true outcome would not be shown. One difference, however, in this version is that on the participant's lottery, all psychics predicted winning and losing outcomes with equal probability, regardless of how biased they were towards one outcome or the other during their example predictions. So here we're decoupling biased psychics from positive information. After that prediction was made, participants were asked, okay, so this psychic predicted that you, for example, lost on this lottery. What do you think the outcome of the lottery was? And they could respond on a continuous scale from 0 being definitely lost to 100 being definitely won. For analyses, we quantified participants' trust in the psychic's predictions as the distance between their reported belief about the outcome and the point of indifference being the midpoint of the scale relative to the direction of the psychic's predictions. In order to test whether positively biased predictors were seen as more credible, what we need to do is examine belief updates between the more positive and the more negative psychics. So here we have a plot of mean belief updates split by how positive the psychic was in their example predictions. This is just a median split by positivity. So on the left, we have psychics whose example predictions included more losses than wins. And on the right, psychics whose example predictions included more wins than losses. Now, these two distributions look pretty similar, but there's still work to be done to establish that they aren't meaningfully different. So in order to do that, we constructed another computational model. Within this model, belief updates were quantified as firstly, a constant or baseline level of belief update that was subject specific, plus an accuracy parameter multiplied by the number of correct predictions the psychic made during their example predictions, plus a positivity parameter multiplied by the number of positive predictions the psychic made. And we multiplied this by a symmetry parameter to allow mean belief updates to differ based on whether the psychic predicted a win or a loss. To test whether the positivity of psychics' example predictions affected belief updates, we can examine the posterior distribution of the group level hyperparameter, which dictates the mean of the positivity preference parameter across all participants. So here the red shaded region indicates what we call the region of practical equivalence. All this means is that parameter values within this region can be treated as not meaningfully different from 0. So as the entire posterior distribution lies within this region, we can conclude that the parameter is effectively equal to 0. In further support of this, when we look at subject level values of the positivity parameter, we can see that all subject parameters lay within this region as well. So from this, we can conclude that positively biased predictors were not seen as more credible. So just to summarize the findings of study 2, we found that biased psychics were not seen as more credible, meaning that the biased information seeking we observed in study 1 is better explained by hedonic tendencies rather than the belief that positively biased predictors are seen as more informative. So just to summarize all of these results together, we find that congeniality bias, that is the tendency to prefer information sources that favor our existing beliefs, may be partially attributable to hedonic preferences. We also found that beliefs formed on the basis of biased information were held in higher confidence, an observation attributable perhaps to the tendency to more readily believe desirable information. That's everything from me, so thank you very much for listening.